Today we have with us Professor Vinod Palkala, and he will be speaking on intangible outcomes in communication for social change, a conceptual exploration. This work will be released as part of an edited volume by Jivitaki and Thomas Duft with Palgrave Macmillan in a few months. Professor Palkala is the Chair Professor of UNESCO Chair for Community Media at the department. His research has been primarily in the areas of communication and social change and community media. He is also the co-chair of Community Communication and Alternative Media section at the International Association for Media and Communication Research. He has kindly prepared a short reading list for us, and I'm sending the link in the chat for everyone to view. Hello, Professor Vinod Palkala. Welcome. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Devina. Thanks everyone for joining this talk. I'm happy to be part of this series that our PhD students are running. Let me just start by wishing everyone Eid Mubarak, and I sincerely apologize for having to schedule this on a festival day. Some of you have, there are people who are not here who have written to me saying that because of Eid they are not able to join. So my apologies for that, and hopefully they'll be able to see a recording of this, and we can catch up later sometime to discuss the paper if you like. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is intangible outcomes in communication for social change, as Devina has already mentioned. And this is primarily going to be a sort of a conceptual exploration. One might call it also a methodological exploration, although I'm not going to suggest too many methodological solutions to the problem that I will posit. Although I'm open to discussing solutions during the Q&A. So this is more of a critique of existing work and the problems I find in the way communication for social change looks at outcomes. Okay. As Devina mentioned, for the sake of better bandwidth and so on, I'm going to switch off my video and maybe bring it back off and on so that you can see me talking. Can you all hear me all right? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, let me start by mentioning that this talk is based on a chapter I'm doing or have done already in this book that's coming up later this year, Communicating for Change, Concepts to Think With, that Professors Jivitaki and Thomas Duft have edited. Palgrave is publishing it. It should be available later this year. So with that little promo for the article, let me just jump right in. Let me start by a very short definition of what I'm talking about. By intangible outcomes, I mean the somewhat impalpable, non-concrete, fluid consequences of directed social change brought about by certain conspicuous communication processes. A lot of words in there. I'm sure it will become clear as we go along. Yeah, it's just something to start with. The idea of intangible outcomes first occurred to us during our fieldwork on the struggle for community radio in India in the early 2000s, where we repeatedly encountered the consequences of community radio in terms that were not very easy to measure. So people talked about how community radio has helped foster identity, has nurtured local language and culture, built capacities for self-expression, and forged community solidarity. Also, during a recent field visit to rural West Bengal to study the role of theatre of the oppressed in addressing issues of gender discrimination, one woman told us, and I quote her, "We have now tasted freedom and we are not going to allow our menfolk to lock us up in the house anymore." Unquote. The gender empowerment implicit in the statement is clearly something that eludes easy measurement. So, if one looks at the literature that's related to studying the effects or impact of communication interventions on individual behavior and social change. All of them are embedded within a hegemonic evaluation matrix that emerged as an integral part of what Thomas Tuchte refers to as institutionalized communication for development, C4D, or what Pradeep Thomas described elsewhere as the corporatization of communication for social change. These approaches, as is well known, privilege the observable, concrete, simple, and hence measurable outcomes of directed social change to the neglect of more complex, emergent, processual, and therefore more intangible outcomes. The evaluation then is based on a set of quantitative indicators and outcomes within what is called a logical framework. Many of you are familiar with this idea of log frame, which in turn is an integral part of the results-based management system, where log frame is a very important thing and it's very common. So social scientists have historically not been blind to the possibilities of intangible outcomes. So if you go back to the sociologist Robert Merton's classic 1936 essay on the unanticipated consequences of purposive social action, this is one of the earliest such expositions that I'm referring to. Merton suggested that the excessive focus on anticipated and tangible effects betrays an unshakable belief in the rationality of purposive social action and a willful ignorance caused by what he called the imperious immediacy of interest. Merton correctly identified some of the bias towards rational social action and its anticipated consequences to the methodological obsession with imputing causation and the issue of attribution in the understanding of goal-directed social action. So let me give you an example by giving you a question along those lines that may read like this. To what extent can we attribute an increase in the number of girl children attending school in a rural area to a particular message from a development agency and its mode of dissemination? The answer, as any self-respecting scholar of communication and social change would give, is it depends. The French economic journalist Frédéric Bastiat in the mid-19th century had famously written about what is seen and what is not, implying an overemphasis on the visible consequences of goal-directed action to the neglect of the less conspicuous unintended effects. Everett Rogers, in his now largely criticized but influential work on diffusion of innovations, identified the potential indirect and unanticipated and even undesirable consequences of innovations. Over the last 2 decades, there has been some acknowledgement of intangible outcomes from the point of view of strategic communication, but with inadequate and unsatisfactory solutions to accounting for them in evaluations. The World Bank's Development Communication Source Book, authored by Paulo Mefalopoulos, states quite unambiguously that both tangible and intangible outcomes of C4D are equally valid and relevant. It goes on to mention mutual understanding, empowerment, and conflict resolution as outcomes that are significant yet defy easy measurement. The document recommends adoption of qualitative research designs for understanding such issues. While quantification of intangible outcomes through, for example, proxy indicators is perceived as a viable solution, it often results in what Alfred North Whitehead in the 1920s had called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Multilateral institutions and international NGOs uphold, on the one hand, the relevance of intangible outcomes, as we have seen with this World Bank document, but at the same time struggle with ways of still tangibilizing the intangible. So one of the people who provides a scathing critique of the imperative for quantitative data suggests that the epistemological bias towards more positivistic, evidence-based research, as well as the global governance discourse, is what is responsible for this for this bias. Sally Engelmary's book called "The Seductions of Quantification" is an example I'm looking at here. Right? See, the global governance discourse has a requirement for accountability, usually upward accountability to donor agencies, to funding agencies, and such. So these are some of the factors, both the bias for evidence-based research as well as the global governance discourse are factors responsible for what Sally Engelmary calls the seductions of quantification. The demand for tangible and measurable outcomes seem to arise from within an institutional matrix, what she calls a regime of power that consists of governments, international donor agencies, multilateral organizations, policymakers, and NGOs, each feeding off a spiral of targets, benchmarks, and indicators. Mary argues that indicators have gained currency because of the perception that they are somehow value neutral and politically unbiased. So the task of indicators then becomes one of taming the intangible and to produce a concrete measure of otherwise complex and even abstract concepts, what I call the intangible. So let's take one example of this process of taming the intangible. Bhutan's gross national happiness, GNH, a concept that caught global imagination for the alternative worldview it represented. Right? However, this apparently intangible idea of happiness has been successfully broken down into 9 different domains, including psychological well-being, health, time use, education, culture, good governance, community vitality, ecology, and living standards. It's been these domains have been further broken down into 33 different indicators and hundreds of variables. Data is then collected from about 8,000 sample households in Bhutan. The process is so driven by standardization that a Bhutanese radio show host lamented that the concept has been quantified to a degree that makes it unrecognizable to ordinary Bhutanese. Asserting that the concept is rooted in the Buddhist ethos, he asserted simply, you don't quantify Buddhism. Once happiness has moved from being an earthly possibility to an earthly entitlement, Bhutan's government felt compelled to measure it in terms of tangible goals. It has been pointed out that construction of such composite indices is problematic because of the subjective decision involved in according relative weight to various aspects of well-being. We can talk about it further if you like during Q&A. So there have been some attempts to come up with some satisfactory resolutions to this problem. For example, the Swedish International Development Agency, SIDA, documented one case of measuring the immeasurable with a concept of empowerment in the context of Bangladesh. Even as the organization acknowledges the argument that often outcomes are intangible, contextual, individual, behavioral, relational, and fundamentally unquantifiable, it goes on to offer what it calls a quantitative analysis of qualitative assessment of outcomes and impacts. Robert Chambers, who is often referred to as the father of participatory methodologies. He wrote a preface to the published report on this project. He described the approach as a methodological breakthrough. The project came up with indicators through a participatory process, which the participants could use to assess themselves, eventually leading to quantification. While suggesting the empowering potential of participatory assessments, Robert Chambers asserts one can convert qualitative dimensions into reliable and valid statistics. The approach offers what they call robust evidence that apparently goes beyond case studies and anecdotes. Calling the compulsion to produce quantitative indicators as a function of both a technology of knowledge production and governance, Sally Engel Merry argues that this leads to the submergence of local particularities and idiosyncrasies into universal categories and ends up generating knowledge that is standardized and comparable across nations and regions. The search then is for ways to capture intangible outcomes of communication for social change without robbing it of its conceptual richness, perhaps through what is known as the interpretivist paradigm, and I'm using it very loosely, very broadly. Interpretivists emphasize how actors construct meaning intersubjectively and make sense of the world in which they live. In the development and social change sector, this need for capturing intangible outcomes becomes manifest in the context of the human rights-based approaches that have become more conspicuous since the 1990s. The results-based management approach, on the other hand, with its emphasis on upward accountability, which I had just mentioned a few minutes ago, is more based on tangible and measurable outcomes. Lemmy and Chucky have instead underlined the importance of participatory, learning, and complexity-based approaches in evaluating communication for development. Giving a concrete example of understanding power relations and political dynamics in a project related to developing community capacity for food production, Law and others suggest processes such as social audits and transparency or integrity evaluation, which they argue would help build solidarity and reveal structural inequalities among communities. The authors argue, and I quote them, many of the impacts that would be considered most important from a human rights perspective and critical objectives of a human rights-based project, such as changes in perceptions, attitudes, and value systems, are intangible. And intangibles present particular challenges to those seeking to evaluate impact. Unquote. These authors discuss various responses to the search for intangible outcomes, each of which ends up being less than satisfactory. I won't go into details. It involves proxy indicators, variables, and so on. What they say about human rights being embedded in a complex environment that defies easy measurement applies also to the field of communication for development. Besides lack of baseline data and the challenge of isolating the role of communication in bringing about the desired change, make it difficult to establish causality. Like when people ask, can you isolate the role played by communication in this project and tell us to what extent communication has brought about change? Right? So it's very difficult to isolate that and establish causality. From an interpretivist lens, reality is socially constructed, and one's social location, relationship to power and hierarchy shape subjective experiences. Programs and policies for development must necessarily bring about change in the lives of marginalized groups in society. So it is imperative that evaluations that seek to gain a more fine-grained understanding of the entire gamut of processes of change must incorporate ways of listening to the voices of those excluded on the basis of class, race, caste, gender, religion, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. Right? So people like Tanya Dreher have drawn attention to the importance of institutional listening to concepts of receptivity, recognition, and response. So I'm trying to argue extending Graham's focus on listening, that failure to account for intangible outcomes arises out of not only political indifference to democratic participation in social justice, but also epistemological disregard for marginalized knowledges. So I draw here from the work of the Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who points out in a brilliant critique of knowledge validated by modern science and rational social engineering, how everything outside that rational knowledge uh, is seen as belonging to the dark world of passions, intuitions, feelings, emotions, affections, beliefs, faiths, values, myths, and so on. Right? So this is, there's a critique that he does in this book where he talks about the various kinds of positivism that demonstrate that what was left out either does not exist or is unimportant or even dangerous. So Santos argues against hegemonic epistemologies and in favor of a plurality of knowledges, suggesting that social justice cannot be delivered without cognitive justice. So, although Santos's call is addressed at a broader global politics of epistemology, his need for interrogating foundational truths by uncovering what lies below their face value can be drawn out to make my case for recognizing the intangible outcomes of directed social change communication. Uh, so part of it is because of the institutional apparatus that Thomas Tuchte and others pointed out, which still emphasize the functionalist and instrumentalist assumptions. Multilateral agencies such as UNICEF have invested heavily in communication for social change through this institutional apparatus of what they call C4D. So when it comes to evaluating C4D, UNICEF continues to persist with measurable indicators of change as insisted by donors, even as they acknowledge the complexities of social change and the challenges of isolating the impact of its communication interventions. The positivistic inclination towards tangible outcomes is evident in various definitions of C4D that they employ. Recent work we did on C4D evaluation strategies show that international agencies to some extent have made a shift to the participatory paradigm, at least in rhetoric, if not always in practice. Right? But this institutional shift continues to coexist with a rather resilient methodological conservatism. Okay, lastly, and I'm going to end with this slide, the development of participatory indicators described by Lenny and others is just one way out, right? Where they have developed a toolkit for participatory monitoring and evaluation, perhaps is one creative way of capturing the intangible results of a communication for social change project. Those that tend to elude evaluators that are armed with predetermined measurement objectives and indicators. Through an empowering research approach and facilitated by inclusive dialogue with various stakeholders, the community-based evaluators arrive at a set of indicators that are more realistic and incorporate ideas of change of a range of factors. Similarly, the SIDA initiative in Bangladesh that I mentioned some time ago collected thousands of qualitative statements from people and converted them into more than 100 indicators, making monitoring and tracking change over time more tangible. The innovative approach did not, however, immediately earn the appreciation from donors who were skeptical of the participatory process and remained committed to conventional evaluation based on predefined outcomes. So this shows the organizational and political challenges that would have to be overcome if one were to attempt to go beyond the positivistic approaches to evaluating communication for social change. In the final analysis, what I'm suggesting is that recognizing the intangible outcomes of communication for social change and accounting for them in institutional practices of impact evaluation are not only ethically warranted, but also methodologically prudent. The recognition of such outcomes which may even be unanticipated in Mertonian terms, and their integration into our evaluation matrix is essential if the process of social change is to be underwritten by principles of human rights, social justice, equity, and listening to people's voices. So what I'm doing is offering an epistemological argument uh, that superficial attempts to reduce the complexity of people's experiences into quantitative indicators is problematic and indicative of a technology of knowledge production. And I'm also offering a political argument that excessive focus on tangible outcomes and the desperate attempts to tangibilize the intangible comes at the cost of voices at the margins, comes at the cost of social justice and equity. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you. So I don't know if I've gone past that time. I'm sure I did. Devina, I'm done. I'm open for questions and answers here.
Yes, thank you so much, Vinod sir. So this presentation is particularly important because it foregrounds people's voices into the process, sort of try to help them co-opt the process more than is usually, for lack of a better word, allowed for. So thank you so much. It's really important according to me. And like you mentioned, not just ethical, but also methodological prudence. It's, I suppose, the way to go forward. I guess to know more about how this can be done, you'll have to get the book. So we'll have live questions from the Zoom meeting participants shortly. And Vinod sir, I will ask you all the Zoom chat and FB live questions and comments towards the end of the meeting. Now I request participants to please raise their hands. So that's an option available next to your username in the Zoom meeting dialog box where you can see your username. And if you cannot find the raise your hand option, you can just ping me in Zoom chat and I'll order your questions accordingly. I will announce your names. Kindly, when I announce your name, turn on your microphone and or video, depending on your connection, and it is your turn to ask. And I request you to please keep your questions as brief as possible so we can have maximum interaction. Vinod sir has been kind to wrap up the session before time, actually on time, so good for us. We have more time for Q&A. We already have a question from Usha ma'am. So, Usha ma'am, if you can unmute yourself and your video.
Yes, my video, okay, I'll try doing that.
But you can stop screen sharing, Vinod sir. Sorry, Usha ma'am, please continue.
Yeah, so you can hear me, right?
Do that. Okay. Stop share. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
So, yeah, so I don't know if you can see me because I'm in a really dark room. That's okay.
Yeah.
So I found a lot of resonance between what you were talking about and what I talked about, the data gaze, right? So, and I like the term taming taming the intangible. So do you think that, as there's a pressure to kind of create models and scalable models, there's, even as we have approaches to make the intangible visible or recordable, even if not quantifiable, there is a process by which there is an increasing reduction of what that intangible is as it moves into a scalable model. How does one resolve that? The need to maintain complexity, but complexity often has to be embedded in context. But as you models, and therefore what happens then to efforts to retain the nuances of the intangible? Yeah. I mean, it's a question. Yeah. You may not have a full answer.
Yeah, no, I don't have a full answer. Thanks, Usha. Your voice was breaking in parts, but I think I got the overall gist of what you're saying. I think, one of the things that I'm addressing is also the institutional apparatus of C4D within which this whole impact evaluation process is embedded. And so many times what Sally Engelmary and others have called the imperative for upward accountability prevents them from recognizing the existence of intangible outcomes or to try hard to tangibilize the intangible. I mean, you and I have constantly struggled in the work that we have done with people talking about the anecdotal evidence that we present and such, right? So I think the challenge for those of us who are positing this sort of alternative approach to incorporating the intangible is to go beyond what may apparently come across as anecdotal, to see how one can systematically account for the intangible outcomes. So systematic doesn't necessarily have to mean trying to convert everything into quantifiable measures, right? So now there are examples, for example, I think we know of participatory development of indicators with stakeholders. The idea that one doesn't go into measuring evaluation with predefined indicators, but work with stakeholders to develop the indicators with them. That stakeholders can define indicators themselves, right? And that they have the power to hold the project to account, interpret its progress, and so on. Right? So this requires some fundamental shift, not only epistemologically, but also politically.
Thank you. Thanks.
So we have Anjali ma'am next. If you could please turn on your microphone and video. And I would request everyone else except the person who's asking the question and Vinod sir to please keep their microphones and videos off.
Yeah, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yeah, Anjali, I can hear you.
Yeah. Professor, that was really insightful and informative. I have just a basic question. Which multilateral agencies, which donor agencies are practicing, this form of finding out how their work is being carried out on the ground? And when do you think the time of intangible outcomes will gain more popularity?
Yeah, I mean, the hegemonic approach to impact evaluation that I was critiquing in this talk is something that almost every donor agency, every multilateral agency that is in the broad field of communication for development deploys, I mean, without exception. So when you apply for a grant related to communication for development, they want you to incorporate a monitoring and evaluation framework, a log frame, what are the inputs, what are the outputs and outcomes. So this comes with a baggage, all of them. However, as I have acknowledged during the presentation, some of these agencies are now beginning to acknowledge that not all outcomes are tangible, not all outcomes can be anticipated, that you need to provide for accounting for the intangible, the unanticipated and such. And some of this that comes with the participatory communication paradigm, participatory communication rhetoric has actually been adopted by many of these agencies. But this is where there is a divide, which I've mentioned during the end of my presentation, that while they seem to have made a paradigm shift conceptually towards a more participatory idea of communication for development, the methodologies still remain fairly conservative because they are compelled to show tangible impact that are measurable, observable and such. Right? So that's the dilemma that's going on, and I think it's a constant negotiation that some of us who are in this domain continue to work with multilateral agencies because some of them are doing good work, and some of them provide some room for negotiation in the methodologies that you incorporate in your work. and it's an ongoing process.
Thank you.
Okay, great. We have John Downey next in line. Are you online, sir?
Hi, John. Great to have you at the talk.
If you could please unmute. Yes.
Hello, everyone.
Yes.
Hi.
Yeah. Hi, John.
Hi. Thank you, Vinod, for a great talk. And I completely agree that developing participatory methods and practices is an important ethical and political project. I was struck very much by the example that you gave in one of your first slides, which was about the results of a community radio program, and it was about women saying, "I'm not going to go back into the house," and that struck me as that you're using that as an example of perhaps something that had unintended consequences and positive consequences. And it struck me there that actually you don't really need participatory methods to actually investigate that change, and we are perhaps talking about tangible outcomes. We're talking about different power relationships between men and women, and there are lots of things that you can measure there in terms of employment, in terms of who makes the decisions or who controls money in the household, who spends the money, all of those sorts of things. And you can also measure differences in beliefs and how those have changed over time. And you can also measure changes in behavior. So for me, it's not so much a question of the intangible and the tangible. It's a question of what is measured and how is it measured. And so I think there's certainly a role for participatory methods, but I think there is also a role for critical social science using relatively traditional methods as well.
Thanks, John. I mean, you're right. I mean, that example to me immediately struck me as this woman being able to go out and attend meetings and contribute to bringing about change in her community. So one can measure the degree of women's participation by looking at the number of women's groups that have been formed, number of women who now are members of these community-based organizations and so on, in sort of measurable ways. But what I was pushing back against is while one can do that using regular methods that we all are familiar with, I'm saying by stopping there, we are actually missing out on a lot of nuance about what it means for this woman to be able to get out of her household and participate in this process. Let's say the change project involves sending girl children to school. It's not just about the outcome of how many girl children have ended up going to school or staying in school at the end of the year, but the whole process of women being able to come out and talk about it, mingle with people like themselves, have horizontal communication processes, the process of empowerment and so on. And mind you, empowerment has also been quantified and reduced to measurable indicators. I mean, it serves some purpose, but I'm pushing ourselves a little more and saying, let's go beyond that to be able to understand the nuances and the intangibility of that empowerment. It's like Bhutan's happiness, So I don't know if it answered your question, but you're right. I mean, it doesn't always require participatory methods to measure that woman's participation. But I'm saying, can we go further down?
Does that answer your question, John, sir? Shall I move on to the next one? Okay, so we have Thirumal sir next in line for live Q&A. If you could please unmute yourself and turn on your video.
Not the video, I'll unmute myself.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Thanks, Vinod.
Hi, Thirumal. Yeah. Thirumal, you're breaking, I think.
Okay, is it? I'm okay.
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. You did mention that Merton, way back in 1936, raises this issue, and so many scholars have done that. How was that it didn't really percolate into the kind of work that policy studies people do? And what was that? Was there a resistance to this? Was certain what Charles Taylor would call as brute facts? There's a way that you would attend to certain kinds of facts and not other kinds of facts. I have no disagreement with whatever you said, but why is this delay in attending to this intangible? That is one. The second point is there are two things that you're raising. One is a methodological question, which the other one is an ethical question, a political.
Yes.
Now, are we to believe that there can be epistemological questions without any ethical implications, and that people in community radio seem to have done work, or that's my ignorance, that it has no ethical implications. I mean, doing this kind of work, that there was that anticipation of this issue seemed to have come a little later to the field. I mean, both are related in some ways, both the political questions as well as the methodological questions.
Yeah, just to thanks Thirumal for those thought-provoking questions. Just to address your second point, I'm not suggesting that the epistemological question and the ethical or political questions are independent of each other. I mean, one might do that for analytical purposes, like I did. I mean, both are quite, intermeshed with each other. I mean, there can't be epistemological questions without ethical questions and so on. I mean, I am not disputing that. I mean, I take your point. But the point about Merton and why it took so long, it is interesting. I mean, people like John Downey here and others might know better. We actually had the Chicago School back in the 1930s, where they did some fascinating urban life studies using very fine-tuned ethnographic qualitative approaches. But I think somewhere in the 1960s or so, I think the quantitative empiricism of American social sciences has pretty much taken over social sciences. I mean, the need to quantify, the need to provide empirical evidence. Merton, as far back as 1936, talked about why this arises. I mean, he talked about the unshakable belief in the rationality of purposive social action. And particularly in the domain that I dabble in, communication for development, a lot of social change interventions are these purposive social actions, goal-directed social change. And what Merton beautifully called, it is driven by the immediacy of interest, right? I mean, you have money that's been put in, you need to show results, right? There is an upward accountability in the governance structures and so on that seems to drive these methodologies. And the need also to establish cause-effect sort of relationships, wanting to impute causation, to attribute change to certain goal-directed social action. That seems to be driving many of these agencies that I'm talking about. So it takes till late 1980s or so for social sciences to take a qualitative turn again, right? And through the 90s, we have a build-up towards discovering more and more of the ethnographic qualitative methods to understand social reality. And even then, we are talking about 20 years ago, it still hasn't percolated so effectively into the kind of agencies that I am talking about that drive the institutional C4D apparatus. Right? There is still a disconnect between making a rhetorical shift to a participatory paradigm and to making a methodological shift to a more inclusive, more ethically inclusive kind of methodologies. Yeah? So I don't know if that fully answers the question, Thirumal, but it's something that one needs to engage with. Yeah.
Okay, we have Anirudh in line next. His connection is a little spotty, so he's only going to start his microphone. Anirudh, you there?
Yes. Can you hear me, Devina?
Yes, please continue.
Hi, Anirudh.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you for that interesting lecture. Sir, actually, my question is related to the institutional development apparatus that you just referred.
Yeah.
And their obsession with the scalability and measuring the obsession with the quantifiable data.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, how does researchers actually negotiate with development agencies to make them realize the importance of actually accommodating intangible outcomes?
Mm-hmm.
And on those lines, are you pushing for a new entry point to make these development agencies or in the academia believe that by accommodating new concepts like intangible outcomes in our social science research, we'll have a more holistic and comprehensive understanding about the social reality that we are encountering?
Possible, Anirudh. I mean, I don't have a formula for how one negotiates with these agencies, with the institutional apparatus, except that, as I mentioned earlier, this is an ongoing process. I mean, we constantly learn. If you are a researcher working with these agencies to study change, to bring about change, one has to constantly negotiate and see where one can find spaces. So one might be doing, one part of your study that's quantitative with measurable, tangible outcomes, but see if you can find some space for the more intangible outcomes. And I think it's important also to, I think this goes back to Usha's earlier question, and my answer to that question is you need to come up with more systematic ways of mapping those intangible outcomes, more systematic methods to capture the intangible, to be able to push against what the institutions call evidence-based research. We often hear this term, we want evidence-based research. What they usually mean is, we want more positivist, empirically driven research that provides solid numbers, quantitative data, and so on. But one needs to constantly push back against it and argue, what evidence could be, what different kinds of evidence that could exist, and how one can systematically capture those kinds of evidence. And I have some examples. I mean, I haven't mentioned them because of lack of time. In the last slide, I was beginning to talk about development of participatory indicators and so on. But there are many other methods. If you or anyone else interested, one can talk about them.
Okay, next we have Caroline ma'am. If you could please unmute yourself and start your video and pose a question.
Hi, Caroline.
Hi, Vinod. Hi. Okay, you see me? Yeah.
I can see.
Hi, everybody. Lovely to be part of this chat and to hear you talk, Vinod. It was really, really insightful and interesting. And I will get the book as soon as it comes out. I have two related questions.
Yeah.
One is around timescale and how we can take the long view and encourage funders to take the long view, because they want an immediate change. Like they want people to go out and vote next month, or they want kids to go to school in September or whatever. So how can we work with funders to make them think long term? But secondly, you know that I have been researching how we can get community media funded by audiences, funded bottom up instead of top down. And I wonder if more emphasis on the intangible benefits and more participatory work will encourage this shift that we're seeing more and more and more for audiences, our viewers and our listeners and our readers, to make small mass contributions to keep the stations going. So from the extreme, like The Guardian, which is making millions every year from individual donations, through to a lot of the grassroots community media stations that are now getting funding from their communities, from people each putting a tiny little bit in every month or to own it. And I think your research and building on this and getting a movement across the world, really, of making the case for the intangible alongside participatory involvement might also add this third element of being able to fund or at least part fund the media through community ownership. So for example, our TV channel in the UK now is owned by community shareholders. It's a cooperative, and it's a fantastic way to engage people. Okay, that's me.
Thanks, Carolyn. No, I think the point about time scale and time duration is a very practical issue that one finds when one begins to work with donor agencies, grant-making agencies. Some of the methodological directions that some scholars are suggesting, including in my talk, take time to be able to study the intangible, to be able to adopt the kind of methods that are required to capture the intangible, takes longer. And the kind of durations that funding agencies, grant-making agencies typically give you, I mean, this is the whole results-based management structure that I'm talking about. I mean, it drives community-based organizations, NGOs crazy. It challenges researchers who want to study communication for social change in trying to show results in quick time. So you end up adopting shorthand methods that are pre-given in a log frame and try to fit in everything and show what the outcomes are. I think this is also a constant process, and I think at least to some extent, some of my colleagues who are present in the talk will agree with me that we have succeeded to some extent in pushing some of our grant-making agencies, our funding agencies, to incorporate ways in which we can capture the intangible, to give us slightly longer time, to provide for more participatory methodologies and so on. So as I said, I mean, this is a constant battle. It's a constant negotiation, and there is always a champion or two in these development agencies who will be on your side. Yeah, and you need to find those spaces and push it a little bit.
And what do you think about the funding issue? Do you think that there is a possibility to fund bottom up now with social media and small micro payments being much more easy?
You're talking in specifically about community media?
Yeah. But it could be community media that is national or even global, not just geographical communities, but communities of interest.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, a lot of the global south contexts in which I operate, it's very difficult to conceive of a formula that works with grassroots funding. I mean, people are struggling with livelihoods and so on. So there is various kinds of grassroots support that non-monetized, but if you are looking at actual funding, it's always a challenge to expect funding from the grassroots, so to speak. I mean, I know that there are successful models in UK, in Australia, and other Western contexts, but in the global South, it's a lot more challenging.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Thanks, Ben.
We are running a little out of time, but we have some very interesting questions that have come from Zoom chat and FB comments. So, Vinod sir and all the participants, I'd like your permission to extend the meeting by 15 minutes. We'll wrap up by 1:15. That's okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So, taking the tangible and intangible debate forward, I'm just posting 3 questions that have come from Preeti, Esther, and Subbarao sir. So Preeti is talking about trying and focusing on non-materialist, affective, normative to probably weave that into policy making. Esther ma'am is asking if there are no established indices to measure intangibles, how do we go about it? And Subbarao sir is asking, based on existing indicators like GDP, health, etc., how we are still missing the intangibles. So how can we go about it? Get bettering governance, bettering the assessment of people's quality of lives. So I've posted this in chat as well for your reference. If you could please tackle these questions.
Yeah, very quick answer to Preeti. Especially in relation to policies and policy making. I mean, I think, Preeti, your own work is a good example of trying to get what's below the surface, to go beyond the material practices and the documents and the legislative documents and so on, and to get to non-state actors. I mean, you do that quite well. I think this is one of the ways in which critical policy making studies can move forward. I mean, to look at the intangible, the non-materialist cultures and so on. So there's a lot of potential there in policy making. There's no doubt. Although my own talk today and the article more broadly doesn't get into policy studies. It's much more about C4D evaluation, impact assessment and such, but I see a lot of potential. Thanks for that comment. Subbarao, see, GDP and those macro indicators are perhaps a given. You can't wish them away. For certain macro level policy frameworks, people do go by this, and one of the imperatives which Sally Engelmerit talks about, which makes people come up with these indicators, is because they are comparable across nations, right? It provides for easy comparisons. But the comparisons across national societal contexts using such indicators has also been problematic, as you know well. I mean, you have also done ethnography, so you know about it. However, the pushback there could be about how to factor in the intangible for policy making as well. I mean, you look at, for example, methods like beneficiary assessments, collaborative outcomes reporting, or there are approaches like critical system heuristics, where you can generate discussions, reflections, critiques with a variety of stakeholders together. So some of it can feed back to policymakers. I mean, so it is a question of how policymakers can provide space for such methodologies, and then the results of such methods can flow back to policymaking. right? I mean, there are methods available to us.
So he also sort of adds to that, once we make frameworks for these intangibles, we are sort of making them quantifiable, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, my problem has been with that temptation to tangibilize everything, to quantify the non-tangible, what is difficult. So, and some of this happens with proxy indicators, yeah, and proxy indicators are a huge problem. Yeah, I mean, so agencies say, well, you want to measure happiness, can't we come up with proxy indicators? You want to measure empowerment, of course, there are 2 or 3 proxy indicators for that. So my problem with that is the reduction that happens in the process of coming up with proxy indicators. So participatory researchers have come up with ways of coming up with indicators that the stakeholders themselves can come up with, yeah? Through a more participatory process where stakeholders say that, you know, X, Y, and Z could be a good indicator of our well-being, and can you use that? Yeah? So, yeah, I mean, one needs to negotiate that.
Right. So we have another question from Ramakrishnan sir. It's rather long, but he's essentially asking if such overwhelming amount of data that we have, does it make sense to migrate to evaluation systems focused on intangibles? And what about the continued resistance within the development sector to change the evaluators processes? So I just posted it in chat for everyone to see. Longer
Devina, your
question.
Voice was breaking, so I'm trying to look at the chat where Ram has
posted
this.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, just, okay. Yes, I mean, Ram is talking about the tension between so-called smart, more quantifiable indicators. Okay, I seem to be back.
Yes.
You can hear me now?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, yeah, I think I got disconnected briefly. I was just addressing Ram's question. So Ram, I mean, the answer is in the governance paradigm, where what is pushed forward very strongly is the upward accountability to donor agencies, governments, multilateral agencies, and so on, that end up relying on log frames and such. Secondly, also the temptation to fall back on the familiar, because the push is for evidence-based research. I think what people like you and others who are doing C4D work at the ground level is to keep pushing back on what one means by evidence-based research. Yeah? The kind of evidence that, let's say, the communities that you work with, you know, on a day-to-day basis have been collecting as community researchers need to play some role in our thinking about communication for change. Yeah? So, yes, there is a huge resistance, but we need to keep pushing at it and find spaces for the kind of thing that we are proposing. I think I lost the rest of the chat messages in the process. So if there's any other question, Devina, you'll have to raise them. I can't read them.
That's not a problem, sir. I'll be gatekeeping all the questions. So Jagdish sir is asking this question about gatekeeping, knowledge gatekeeping. I've just posted it in chat. And he's asking whether open science or open communication is the way forward.
So I don't know if Jagdish is on a Zoom call or elsewhere, but yeah, I mean, there's some movement that has started now. The Journal of Communication has called for some thinking on some perspectives on open science and open communication. some of us are trying to respond to that. I think what JOC's call for open science is somewhat limited. It's working within a quantitative methodological paradigm, and some of us who are beginning to discuss on the sidelines to respond to this are saying we need to broaden this to include alternative epistemologies, to talk about decolonization of knowledge, to talk about qualitative, ethnographic work and such. So yeah, I mean, in a different way, open science, open communication is perhaps the way, but let's define what we mean by open science and open communication.
He did mention the context of ICA, and perhaps we should look into the President-elect's message on Professor Claes de Vries, available on the conference platform and on YouTube. So we did have some reservations about open communication, especially in the Global South. And I believe after initial skepticism, people are beginning to look at the possibility of open science is the way forward, but a lot remains to be seen how we can use that here, given that we already have issues of access and digital divide and things like this.
So now that call has now been translated to a GOC special issue.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So they are inviting extended abstracts. So anybody who's interested, please, especially if you've participated in ICA and have to do with the theme of open communication, look at their CFP and see if you can give it a shot. I want to squeeze in one quick question from Kanchan ma'am in chat. She's asking...
It's been addressed, I think. Do you want to give a chance to Esther first?
Oh, so we've covered Preeti, Esther ma'am's and Subbarao sir's questions.
Then go ahead.
Yeah, my question has been answered, I think.
Yeah,
but
go ahead, Devina.
Thank you.
Yes, so Kanchan ma'am is wondering about methods and how we can probably use thick descriptions and find measurable ways of analyzing them, which could make it probably useful for policy making or for affecting other sort of change.
Yeah, more about mixed methods.
Yeah, you're right, Kanchan. I mean, there is already a move to mixed methods and triangulation. It's been going on for a while. I'm only saying that we need to deepen that approach. I mean, some of these mixed methods research is also becoming a rather mechanical way of incorporating the conventional and the more qualitative kind of methodologies. I mean, which is good. I mean, which is a beginning. But I'm saying we need to deepen that approach to incorporate alternative epistemologies, to bring in ethically the voices of the marginalized and to connect it to issues of social justice and so on, right? So some of the mixed methods research, as you know, is still embedded in a very sort of a scientific, quote unquote, scientific framework, which is an okay beginning, but we need to go beyond that. So I don't know, Kanchan, if, I mean, we can talk about it, but...
Yeah, thank you, sir. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vinod sir. That is all the time we have today for Q&A.
Thank you, Devina. Thanks everyone for being here. So if there are some unanswered questions, maybe I'll go check on Facebook and see if I can address some of those questions. You all know how to reach me. So yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
So we have asked a few questions from the FB comments here, but if there are more questions that we couldn't ask for lack of time, we could definitely do that. And Pranay also shared here on Zoom and on FB that if you guys have more questions that you couldn't answer, you could please post them there or email it to him, and we could always ask them later. So this was the last Monday of May, and we have a fabulous lineup of speakers for June. We'll be releasing the poster with the monthly schedule shortly. However, here's what's happening next Monday. We meet Professor Mohan Datta from Massey University, who will discuss communication inequalities and discursive erasures, the fate of migrant labor during the COVID-19 crisis in India. Thank you so much for joining us today. See you next Monday.
Thank you.